Dedra Miro demonstrates that the Empire's capacity for systemic violence did not depend on supernatural power. Her rise within the Imperial Security Bureau illustrates how bureaucratic structures can produce efficient actors who execute state violence through procedure rather than ideology. Throughout Andor, Dedra's actions arise from institutional incentives rather than personal malice, making her an empirically grounded example of authoritarian function inside the Empire. Her ascent within the ISB begins with routine administrative work, specifically her review of overlooked incident reports and supply irregularities. She identifies patterns that others dismiss, such as the distribution of stolen Imperial equipment and scattered rebel activity. These scenes show that her effectiveness is derived from detailed file analysis, not force-driven intuition. The Empire rewards this skill because the system prioritizes compliance, efficiency, and surveillance. Dedra's rise therefore reflects institutional preference rather than exceptional individual cruelty. The ISB meetings in which she presents her findings reveal the operational norms of the organization. Officers focus on quantitative metrics, zones of responsibility, and chain of command protocol. Dedra's adherence to these norms, combined with her willingness to challenge colleagues through procedural argument rather than personal attack, positions her as an effective bureaucratic actor. Her success is framed not as ideological extremism, but as administrative competence within an authoritarian environment. Dedra's interrogation of Bix Colleen further indicates that her methods derive from institutional training rather than personal sadism. She uses approved psychological techniques, structured questioning, and sanctioned sensory torture. The equipment and protocols she employs have been standardized, indicating that the Empire systematically developed non-force-based interrogation methods applicable across its intelligence branches. Dedra's behavior is consistent with institutional guidelines rather than improvised cruelty. Her reliance on documentation and policy is also central to her characterization. She frequently cites procedural authority when confronting other ISB officers, and she requests jurisdiction expansions through proper channels. These actions show that her influence does not arise from violent charisma or mystical persuasion. Instead, she leverages bureaucratic structure as a mechanism for obtaining control. This demonstrates that the Empire's authoritarianism is sustained by administrative norms rather than exceptional individuals. Throughout the series, Dedra repeatedly emphasizes compliance with the Empire's legal framework. Scenes depicting her investigation into Ferrix illustrate her focus on identifying procedural gaps in Imperial control, not on expressing personal animus toward the population. Her decisions stem from the ISB's strategic objectives, including information extraction, operational containment, and suppression of insurgent communication networks. Her conduct follows the organization's mandate rather than personal vendetta. Her analytical skills also highlight the Empire's dependence on ordinary professionals who can convert surveillance data into actionable intelligence. Dedra identifies rebel activity not through intuition, but through comparative analysis, recognizing recurring patterns across various sectors. This demonstrates how authoritarian systems rely on the routine labor of administrators to operationalize repression. Dedra's rise is a case study in how bureaucracies amplify harm by rewarding pattern recognition aligned with state interests. Dedra's interactions with Major Partagaz further reinforce this framework. Partagaz praises her precision, discipline, and compliance with investigative protocol. His feedback is based on performance metrics, not ideological fervour. This institutional validation encourages her escalation of methods. The system thus incentivizes increasing levels of coercion, creating a feedback loop in which effective repression is equated with professional advancement. By analysing Dedra's work routines, it becomes clear that she rarely takes initiative outside sanctioned channels. She files reports, requests authorization, and coordinates multi-department operations. These behaviours illustrate how the Empire's violence is coordinated through administrative cohesion rather than mystical dominance. Dedra exemplifies the type of mid-level official whose adherence to protocol facilitates systemic oppression. Her approach to the Ferrix uprising provides additional evidence. Dedra responds by implementing containment procedures, identifying communication choke points, and requesting reinforcement based on ISB threat assessments. Her decisions align with established counterinsurgency doctrine rather than improvisational brutality. Her conduct reveals how bureaucratic systems can escalate violence through standardized response mechanisms rather than reactive panic. Deidre is never depicted as seeking personal glory beyond career advancement. Her requests for additional sectors, personnel, and authority reflect professional ambition rather than ideological extremism. This distinguishes her from characters such as Vader or the Inquisitors, whose actions are driven by the dark side. Deidre's role demonstrates that the Empire does not require force-sensitive agents to maintain dominance. It requires individuals motivated by career progression within a hierarchical apparatus. The absence of mystical influence in her behavior is significant. At no point does Deidre express awareness of Sith doctrine, Force metaphysics, or the ideological underpinnings of the Emperor's deeper political goals. She engages with the Empire solely through administrative logic. This positions her as an empirical example of authoritarian violence emerging from institutional incentives rather than metaphysical corruption. Deidre's characterization presents an analytical contrast to traditional Star Wars villains. Her threat level derives from procedural mastery, not personal power. She interrogates, surveils, and represses because these actions align with the ISB's expectations. The series repeatedly emphasizes that her influence expands not through exceptional acts, but through consistent adherence to operational guidelines. This demonstrates how authoritarian systems depend more on bureaucratic actors than on singular figureheads. Her presence also reveals the Empire's structural redundancy. The system produces many individuals capable of similar harm, meaning the removal of any one actor would not alter the institution's functionality. Deidre is not portrayed as uniquely irreplaceable. Rather, she represents a replicable product of the Empire's administrative culture. This explains why the Empire remains stable despite constant internal conflict among its leadership. Deidre's role in Andor empirically demonstrates that the Empire's capacity for harm is grounded in structure, incentives, and institutional design. The series uses her character to show that authoritarian systems function through bureaucratic processes rather than mystical power. Deidre Miro operates entirely within the boundaries of administrative authority, revealing that the most dangerous components of the Empire are not Sith Lords, but bureaucrats whose ambition aligns with state repression. Deidre Miro's actions throughout Andor demonstrate how authoritarian regimes convert baseline professional ambition into mechanisms of oppression. Her progression within the Imperial Security Bureau is not framed as ideological radicalization, but as the logical outcome of an institution that equates efficiency with loyalty and loyalty with coercive capability. Deidre's conduct reveals how ordinary occupational goals can escalate into significant contributions to state violence when channeled through an authoritarian framework. Her pursuit of career advancement mirrors the internal culture of the ISB, where officers compete for territory, influence, and operational authority. In early meetings, Deidre expresses dissatisfaction with her assigned sector, arguing for jurisdictional extension based on overlooked evidence. This behaviour is not presented as ideological militancy, but as adherence to institutional norms prioritizing aggression, initiative, and measurable results. The system encourages officers to identify threats aggressively because perceived threats justify departmental expansion. Deidre's increasing authority correlates with her willingness to apply coercive methods. When she gains control over the Ferrix investigation, she expands surveillance, implements strategic communication lockdowns, and authorizes interrogative procedures that align with ISB doctrine. Her operational enhancements do not arise from personal hostility toward Ferrix, but from procedural alignment with the Bureau's emphasis on comprehensive control. Deidre becomes more repressive, not because she seeks cruelty, but because repression is the metric of success within her institution. Her methods during the interrogation of Bix Kalin provide a clear example of how professional ambition within an authoritarian apparatus yields escalatory violence. Deidre's decision to use auditory torture is presented as a calculated response derived from standardized ISB manuals rather than improvised brutality. The technique's deployment demonstrates that the Empire institutionalized torture as a routine tool of governance, and that officials like Deidre simply apply these tools when seeking reliable intelligence. Deidre's internal communications with superiors highlight the structural mechanisms that reward her methods. Major Partagaz consistently frames success in terms of analytical rigor, operational efficiency, and adherence to procedure. Deidre's escalations are validated because they align with these metrics. This creates an incentive structure where increasingly intrusive and coercive actions become the most reliable means of career progression. Deidre's professional trajectory illustrates how authoritarian organizations normalize harm by embedding it within promotion criteria. Her interactions with subordinates also demonstrate internalization of ISB operational standards. She issues orders that stress containment, surveillance, and extraction of usable intelligence. These directives follow the Bureau's hierarchical decision-making model, which prioritizes central control over local autonomy. Deidre's behavior mirrors the ISB's culture of vertical command flows and strict compliance, indicating that her authoritarian tendencies emerge from institutional expectations rather than personal pathology. Deidre's role in consolidating the empire's counterinsurgency strategy illustrates the broader bureaucratic logic of authoritarianism. Her analysis of scattered rebel incidents transforms disparate data into a unified operational picture. This analytic function demonstrates how bureaucrats convert minor disturbances into justification for large-scale repression. Deidre's work is not framed as ideological extremism, but as professional due diligence, revealing how bureaucratic analysis can inadvertently validate state overreach. The Ferrex uprising illustrates how Deidre's ambitions intersect with systemic authoritarianism. Her operational response focuses on threat classification, force deployment, and information control, all consistent with established imperial doctrine. Deidre's insistence on capturing key individuals such as Kino and Andor is based on operational value rather than ideology. These actions demonstrate how an ordinary officer, acting within procedural boundaries, can contribute significantly to repressive outcomes. Deidre's near-fatal encounter during the Ferrex riot provides insight into the misalignment between bureaucratic perception and public reality. Her surprise at the crowd's hostility indicates a disconnect between ISB internal culture and the lived experiences of imperial subjects. Deidre operates under the assumption that order is universally valued, a belief reinforced by her professional training. The riot exposes the inherent instability of authoritarian bureaucracies that misinterpret compliance as legitimacy. Her narrow escape during the riot also reveals the limitations of bureaucratic authority in contexts of public unrest. Deidre expects institutional hierarchy to translate into field dominance. When confronted with mass resistance, she experiences operational breakdown, demonstrating that bureaucratic control mechanisms become vulnerable in high-intensity environments. This moment highlights the fragility of systems that rely heavily on fear rather than consent. Deidre's post-riot reflection illustrates her inability to recognize the moral implications of her actions. She interprets the uprising not as a reaction to systemic injustice, but as an operational challenge requiring improved ISB procedures. This analytical framing aligns with her training, which emphasizes problem-solving through force, rather than addressing underlying grievances. Her reaction exemplifies how bureaucrats in authoritarian regimes rationalize unrest as failure in implementation, not as feedback on the system itself. Her continued commitment to ISB objectives after the riot demonstrates institutional reinforcement mechanisms. Despite personal danger, Deidre remains focused on achieving strategic goals. This persistence is not fueled by ideological fervor, but by professional expectations and an internalized belief in procedural correctness. Her behavior reflects how authoritarian bureaucracies sustain momentum even when individual actors face personal risk or moral contradiction. Deidre's arc also highlights the role of data centralization in maintaining authoritarian control. By consolidating intelligence from multiple sectors, she strengthens the empire's capacity to identify dissidents and predict insurgent activity. Her analytical contributions illustrate how bureaucratic data processing can significantly enhance state surveillance capabilities. Deidre's success thus demonstrates how authoritarian regimes rely on non-ideological expertise to maintain power. Her position within the ISB demonstrates systemic redundancy. She is neither uniquely gifted nor irreplaceable. The Empire's structure is designed to produce multiple competent actors capable of fulfilling similar roles. Deidre's rise suggests that, in the absence of supernatural elements, the Empire retains sufficient bureaucratic infrastructure to sustain authoritarian control. This redundancy underscores the institutional nature of the Empire's power, independent of Sith influence. Deidre's narrative in Andor demonstrates that the Empire's authoritarian capacity is rooted in its bureaucratic structure rather than mystical power. Her ambition, combined with institutional incentives, produces a form of violence that is methodical, rationalized, and deeply integrated into administrative norms. Deidre Miro exemplifies how authoritarian regimes transform ordinary professionals into key agents of systemic oppression through the mechanisms of bureaucracy, data analysis, and procedural authority.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.